The idea behind today's session is to take you through a little bit of the work that we're doing in the internet way of networking. I'm sure and I'm hopeful that most of you is familiar with this project that we're doing at the Internet Society that we started last year. But I'll take you through a little bit more about what the purpose of the project is, some of the work that we did in 2020, and some important outputs from 2020 that is now guiding the work in 2021. And also talk a little bit about what's coming up in the project and how you as community members can be involved and what we're hoping for this project to lead in 2021 and beyond. So to give it a little bit of a context, as I'm sure everyone is aware of and familiar with, there's a lot of things happening in digital policy more broadly, and especially in internet policy, both from a policy side where governments are trying to regulate and address challenges that they see on the internet, but also business developments with increasing centralization, consolidation in various markets. And all of these developments have an impact on the internet or could impact the internet. And this is what we want to make sure that stakeholders are aware of and also address if possible to make sure that you do not harm the internet going forward. So for instance, important regulations that have been in place over the years, like intermediate liability protections, is now being challenged, mainly due to addressing issues with large platform companies like Facebook. But in the midst of those developments, there's a risk that protections for other intermediaries in the internet that are important for the network's operations could be sort of caught up in the whirlwind. So the idea behind this project is to try to help policymakers and other stakeholders to see what could be the impact on the internet itself. And this is just an example of some of the developments that I'm sure that you've heard of and are familiar with. You know, encryption is another project that we have at the Internet Society where governments are looking to figure out, is it possible for them to break encryption or find ways to read encrypted communications? And of course, at the Internet Society, we think this is an inherently bad idea, for instance, to undermine encryption. But there's other developments as well. You've seen this in sort of geopolitical struggles that's playing out between the United States and China in terms of the United States banning certain services like TikTok. In 2020, there was a initiative by the Trump administration called the Clean Networks Act that was targeting Chinese network operators and service providers to not be having access to the US markets and so forth. So there's a lot of developments also on that geopolitical scale that could have an impact on the internet. And in the midst of all this, what kind of guidance can the Internet Society provide, and how can we ensure that the internet stays healthy going forward? And what we kind of hoping to do is to describe that the internet is not just this artifact out there that we can take for granted, but that it is really a networking model that comes with a set of benefits that can be extremely helpful. And we saw that during the coronavirus pandemic, where a lot of governments weren't prepared for this pandemic coming into place. But in a way, the internet was prepared because the internet is able to adapt to new demands, to address new traffic demands and so forth. So the internet actually fared quite well during the pandemic in terms of meeting a new demand, meeting a surge in traffic demand over a very short period of time, and being able to deliver on those services, for instance, that were needed in a time where people had to work from home or had less of an access to meet in physical person. So this is really the essence of the internet way of networking, to inspire people to protect this networking model and to recognize that it is, in fact, a unique construct that we cannot take for granted, and that it's important to preserve what really makes it work. And the way we started thinking about this was really from this quote that you see on the screen. So there's this expression, which is very much a description also of the internet, that the internet is a network of networks. But that only tells you so much about what the internet is. Could we kind of fill in the contours here and say something more about what makes the internet the internet? Beyond just being a network of networks, can we say something more to describe this, this important technology that we're all protecting and preserving and promoting globally? Can we say something more than it just being a network of networks? So what we came up with in 2020, and which was part of a policy development process that I hope, and then I know actually that many of you were involved with in 2020, was to articulate what we see as the critical properties of the internet, those foundational pillars that really makes the internet the internet. And the idea here was try to kind of find the very essence of what makes the internet the internet. So we were looking at things that could have a broad consensus in the community in terms of defining features, if you will, about the internet. So we identified 5 of those. So for instance, that the internet is striving to have an accessible infrastructure with a common protocol. That you have an open architecture in the internet where you have interoperable and reusable building blocks, meaning that you could have a technology being repurposed for something else going forward. Also, that you have a decentralized internet where you have a distributed routing system, for instance, is a very distinct and important feature of the internet. That you have a set of global common identifiers like the IP addresses or domain names, for instance. Also, importantly, that it's technology neutral and a general purpose network. It's not designed to just host a specific application, but effectively just moves data packages, and it's up to the endpoints to figure out what do you want to do with that connectivity, and that allows it to host a whole range, almost infinite number of different applications as possible. So these critical properties are to describe what we think distinguishes the internet from other types of networking models and what makes it really unique. And the way that we express these critical properties are kind of in their ideal state. This is what you should strive for when you're doing networking the internet way. So if you're thinking about, for instance, that the internet today, we have 2 protocols in place actually with Internet Protocol version 4 and version 6. So you actually have 2 protocols in place in the current internet, but the strive should be towards 1 protocol. That's what the model is aiming for, because that allows you to have end-to-end connectivity among the endpoints. So we wanted to articulate this in order to try to describe these are elements that are important to consider when you're doing policy to protect these critical properties, and what you should be striving for optimizing in the networking model. And that kind of provides with this principled lens of what would be good or bad developments for the internet. A good development is something that strengthens these properties, moves it closer towards this ideal state, while a bad policy would be something that moves it away or completely chips away and takes away one of these properties. And the more we move away from this ideal state, or if we chip away from one of these critical properties, that's where we start degrading and potentially lose the internet going forward. It would be a bad development. And this is just a summary of the critical properties themselves, but importantly also some of the benefits that they give you in this way of how you do networking. So for instance, if you have a decentralized management and distributed routing system that allows for networks to optimize their traffic according to their own needs. So this was an important feature during the Corona pandemic, for instance, that you can, as a network, decide who do you want to interconnect with to make sure that your users have the best possible paths out to the internet, what kind of traffic demands do you have at each point in time, and so forth. So the ability for networks to make these autonomous decisions is incredibly important to make the whole thing work and for them to allow it to be work independently. Similarly, if you have a common global identifier system that allows you to have this constant addressability and coherent view of the internet so that you can actually address each endpoint in a consistent manner, and thereby allow for having this end-to-end connectivity as well. So that was a little bit about this internet way of networking, where we're trying to describe the internet, what we think is essential and critical features of it. And I should say that they're not kind of exhaustive in the sense of only describing what's important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in this presentation, but it's really the defining and critical pillars that makes the internet the internet. There are other things that are also important from a user perspective and that is important to preserve in the internet. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But the way that this internet way of networking fits into the broader strategy is that we want it to be a piece of what we call internet impact assessments. So what you see on the screen here is an example that hopefully can be a good kind of a picture to help remember the purpose of this work. So what you see on the screen here is, of course, that you have a highway that was built around a forest. And you would hope that when this highway was built, that someone did an environmental impact assessment, trying to take into consideration, okay, what is the impact on, for instance, biodiversity in that forest? And this is something that is becoming more and more in the norm in many parts of the world, that when you are doing different types of policies, you consider the environmental impact because we assign a high value to the environment. We want to preserve it, and we want to understand the consequences on the environment when we do certain policies or interventions. And this is the kind of analogy that we're having here for the internet, that when you do new policies, when you do new interventions, that policymakers and other decision makers should think about this as doing internet impact assessments. Just as you would do for the environment, you should do some kind of assessment to see, is there potential impact here on the internet due to this intervention? So that's the basic idea of this project, is to encourage people to take in consideration the internet and do some type of impact assessment of how a new development would affect the internet going forward. And to do this, we started building in 2020 what we call the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. And this toolkit is really aimed to be kind of well, literally a toolkit where you can go in and find documentation that would help you sort of approach an internet impact assessment. And the idea here is that the audience it's policymakers and governments on the one hand, but it's also technologists and other internet users that are interested in doing an analysis, perhaps for their own purposes or for their own advocacy. And ideally, this toolkit will help protect that foundation of the critical properties by illuminating and helping guide potential impact on the internet. So what does this toolkit consist of? Well, the way that it started shaping out in 2020, and I should mention here that this toolkit was released in, I think, October of 2020. So it's a relatively new thing from the Internet Society. We started building it in 2020, but wasn't published until Q3 of 2020. So it's a collection of tools that we hope will guide interested users, both policymakers, technologists. And it includes, first of all, this foundational document that I just talked about that describes the internet way of networking. And you can think about that as kind of this baseline reference document that describes what is really important. Then we also have use cases of internet threats. And the idea of these use cases is that you would take a specific policy issue, for instance, intermediary liability protection, and the use case describes what would be the impact on these critical properties from removing those protections, for instance. Or we also have one, for instance, on interconnection or routing, how those policies that interfere or try to mandate or require certain routing procedures or interconnections, how would that interfere with the internet way of networking? So these use cases are meant to be kind of like guiding lenses at a general level that you as a user of the toolkit could apply for a specific case. So for instance, if you were in a country that is considering, having some type of policy that mandates certain interconnection patterns, you can use this use case to describe the potential impact on the internet because it describes the impact at a more general level. You can help that as a guidance when looking at a specific case, like a policy in your country or another country. It includes an infographic questionnaire that just helps sort of map out this process, some promotional videos and so forth. And this is a work in progress. So we're hoping to expand this toolkit over time, both through the work of staff, where we're working on use cases, but also with the help of you. And that's the bigger vision of this project, is for this toolkit to be increasingly fed with insights and analyses from our community to help build this hub of knowledge for other interested community members and other interested members in the internet community more broadly. A small addition that we did this year is a kind of a survey or a questionnaire where if you're interested to know if a case that you have, for instance, is of relevance to the impact assessment, you can take this questionnaire that has a kind of a set of questions that will help guide you as to whether or not the case that you have, this particular policy that you're thinking about, is this policy relevant for an internet impact assessment? So it's kind of a first screening to just help guide, yes, this particular policy issue seems to be in need of an impact assessment. And this is just to emphasize that the purpose of this work is not to say that internet regulation is bad, right? I think there is a misconception sometimes that the Internet Society or the work that we're doing would be against regulation. That is absolutely not the purpose. The idea here is to make sure that you have smart regulation and regulation that is compatible with how the internet works. So we're hoping that this toolkit will actually enable stakeholders to take the actions that they need without harming the internet itself, to help provide that guide that if I'm doing X, would this impact the internet? And that helps you inform decisions going forward. So this is really what we're hoping to achieve with this impact assessments. And again, the best analogy to think about what we're trying to do is to look at the environmental space. If someone would do an environmental impact assessment of, for instance, a new policy, you always have the option to see, okay, this is harming the internet, and someone might go ahead and do it anyways. But at least that impact assessment has been done, and you can hold people to account for knowing the impact of your decisions. So that's another important piece here, that you can hold decision makers to account for potential harms to the internet, because you can enlighten them in advance that this policy or this technology that you're introducing, it's going to negatively impact the internet in this way. We've told you so, you still went ahead, and so forth. So it's an opportunity to both inform people in advance and also hold decision makers in account afterwards as well. But this is very much just the beginning of the work. As I mentioned, the critical properties are really the critical parts of the internet. And what we're doing in 2021 is to expand this lens of just looking at critical properties to also look at what we call enablers for the internet. So if you want to have, for instance, a secure global network, the critical properties would not be they wouldn't be sufficient to make sure that you have a secure internet going forward. There are other elements that allows you to have security on the internet. So to make sure that those features can also be captured, we're looking at expanding the lens from not only be about critical properties, but also enablers of these other desirable aspects of the internet. For instance, what is an enabler of security going forward? What is an enabler of making sure that you have a open internet or a globally connected internet? Other features that are important. So Andrei is leading that work in 2021, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you have questions about this. But the idea is really to expand the lens to not only capture what is critical, but also things that are highly desirable or extremely important for actually making use of the internet. So we're doing that work right now in drafting a document that look at these enablers, and we will have a policy development process starting in Q3 where we're looking for your feedback and ideas about this work. We're also hoping to expand the sort of awareness and understanding of this work, because there's a lot of information to digest. For some people that are very familiar with internet technologies, some of the critical properties, for instance, might resonate very easily and be something that is sort of very close to heart and very familiar with. But if you're coming new to this, there's a lot of new things there to digest. So we're working on a training that we'll be releasing in May that provides kind of an introduction to this concept of the internet way of networking and describes a little bit the rationale for doing internet impact assessments. As also mentioned, we're really looking for contributions to help expand this toolkit over time. Currently, I think we have 5 use cases, if I'm not mistaken, that describes this general relationship between, for instance, a policy like intermediary liability protections and the internet. But we're hoping to expand that and find more use cases that could provide helpful guidance to people that want to do impact assessments. And the idea here is really that anyone should be able to do these analyses. It shouldn't be the sort of exclusive ability of staff or technical members in our community. It should really be everyone that could make these links and do impact assessments. So we're hoping to expand this toolkit over time, and we really need your help with that as well. If you have a use case that you think would be interesting, to reach out to us and to work with us on developing one of those use cases, because that's going to be something that can guide other community members going forward. We're also hoping to work with other stakeholders to understand any potential gaps or deficiencies in this work. This is an ongoing work that needs to be improved over time. The grand vision in the end here is that this is a toolkit that can kind of just allow people to work highly independently and take the resources, do their analysis, use it in their advocacy, and for the Internet Society community to almost speak like a shared voice in terms of the concerns that we see and how it would impact the internet. But that's going to take some time. And this is a work that needs to be scrutinized and challenged over that time. So we're constantly looking for feedback to understand any potential gaps in this work, deficiencies in the way that we describe the internet way of networking, for instance. And the expansions of these enablers that I'm mentioning would definitely be part of that feedback that we're looking for. Are we capturing the right thing? Are we missing something that is really important for enabling a globally open internet? That should be part of this framework and be part of the lens that you need to understand an impact. So we're constantly looking for feedback on this work to make sure that it can be improved over time. What I'll do also is to kind of stop at this slide after I presented it, and we can do, well, start the Q&A here perhaps to see if there's questions about this. But just wanted to take you through some of the upcoming things where we need your help and opportunities to be involved. So first of all, I mentioned that we have this training course, this e-learning course that we've created to provide an introduction to the concept and the idea of internet impact assessments. It's currently in production, but will be released in mid-May. And you can already now register for the learning course, and it's up on our website, the registration links. And I can share the exact link afterwards. Of course, we're hoping to get help spreading this work, to get your help in spreading the word about the idea of internet impact assessments, the internet way of networking, because this is a concept that ideally should be pervasive within the internet community, that people sort of instinctively think, okay, how would something impact the very foundations of the internet? How would I think about that? The Internet Society has some guiding tools here that can provide a first step and help us think about that. We also need help with reaching out to decision makers. If you are, interested in doing advocacy, for instance, in your local community, to help us reach out to policymakers, their staff, help us train them about the internet way of networking and this idea of impact assessments, encourage them to take trainings, and broadly spread the acknowledgement of the importance of doing these impact assessments, and as well urge those decision makers to think 2 steps in their decisions and think about the need for an impact assessment to make sure that the internet doesn't come to harm as we promote change going forward. If you're addressing hate speech online, for instance, are there policies that are more or less sort of harmful for making the network itself working? Those kind of questions should be raised, and they should be put on the minds of those decision makers that make those decisions, because there are challenges in the current internet environment that needs to be addressed, but it's important that they're addressed in the right way and do not sort of undercut the very pillars of the internet itself. And of course, we're looking for you to also work together to work with other community members. We're very much hoping that this toolkit will allow community members to work independently and to organize their own efforts. For instance, by producing their own analysis to use in their advocacy, and to hold up this idea of impact assessments and the internet way of networking in their communications. Help us identify other organizations that you think should be part of this work, partners to us or to you in your local communities that can be helpful in spreading this work, or perhaps contributing to impact assessments and so forth. And importantly, also help us build this toolkit going forward. If you have use cases or case studies that you think would be interested in doing an analysis on, let us know, or pitch us ideas. We would love to expand this with the help of our community. And I should mention there that one of the things that we're working on in the short term is also a kind of user manual for how you would produce these short case studies. We call them Internet Impact Assessment Screenings. And those are documents in the size of around 3 to 5 pages. And we're producing a guide for how you could do that initial screening of a policy to produce a preliminary assessment with a toolkit that would kind of give you a first idea of what would be the impact of this policy or technology on these critical properties and consequently the internet. And of course, to help us spread this word, hold briefings, workshops around this topic in your local communities and with other stakeholders. I haven't been able to keep track of the chat, but I'm happy to stop here and take any questions.
Thank you, Carl. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first question is, the idea of security and resilience of the internet will be added to the enablers or to the properties?
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. So very good question. And this is a good example of what would be added in the enablers. So as I mentioned, security, the importance of security is currently not captured by the critical properties, but we would have an enabler that gets to that point around security so that you could see, okay, if we degrade this enabler, how would that impact a security dimension of the internet? I'll let Andrei jump in because he's been working closest with the enablers. If there's, I can't remember the name of the exact enablers that we had thought about for security, but I think resilience was part of them, or availability of resources, for instance, in security work. Andrei, do you want to jump in on that question as well?
Sure, and I think Jacques' second question also relates to this, so I can cover both. So if you look at the current Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, the scope is very tight. It's basically limited to the Internet technical infrastructure. So not all facets of the Internet as an ecosystem are really covered. So you may look at this as really looking at the foundational things, and that are extremely important, because of course, if you affect the foundation, that has long-lasting and very severe effects, or may have, on the internet. So you look at the internet way of networking as the foundational thing that also enables healthy evolution of the internet. Our work this year, we're looking at the sort of higher level, looking at the components of our mission, things that we as community are striving for the internet that is open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. So we're linking those enablers to those higher level goals, and that's where security comes in. So you can think that critical properties are necessary conditions to enable healthy evolution and good foundation of the internet. But there needs to be some other conditions or facilities put in place to make this internet open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. To give you an example of some enablers, and specifically in the area of security, well, basically we didn't invent the wheel. We looked at the security and this triad of security, and 3 enablers that relate to this area are integrity, confidentiality, and availability. And by enablers, one thing is that we make this model more open. So while critical properties, I think we made a very thorough analysis, and we also were inspired by some of the Internet Architecture Board principles of the Internet architecture. For enablers, it's more open. It's really a way to analyze certain developments. And if you find something, some condition or facility that is really necessary to have an open or trustworthy or globally connected internet, that's your enabler. So with the enabler like integrity or confidentiality, I think we will be able to analyze things like how some policies that affect encryption can damage the internet. So that's to give you a few examples. I hope that answers your question.
All right, and we also have a hand up. Emmanuel would like to speak, so I'm going to pass the floor to him. Emmanuel, you can unmute your microphone if you wish to speak. Okay, while we wait for that, is there any more? There's no more questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you may raise your hand and we will give you the floor to speak, or you may also just add your question to the chat or the Q&A and we'll get to you.
And happy to answer any broader questions as well about this work, if there's work about the process going forward and so forth. While we look for other questions, I can just speak a little bit more about some of the work that we're doing short term, and it came to mind when I saw Emmanuel's name, because we're also this year partnering with a youth organization called Dear Governments, who have been conducting their impact assessments themselves, and in my view provides a really good model for what we're hoping this work to go, where interested partners take our toolkit, they incorporate an impact assessment in their own analysis, and thereby help spreading the library, if you will, of cases where this impact assessment is being done and how you can conduct these impact assessments. So I see that we had two more questions. So first from Paul about the date of the e-learning course. We have that as the 17th of May. That is the date that it's planned to go out. And yes, I'm not sure if that's mentioned on the online registration, but we will confirm that date in the registration links if you register online. And then we have another question from Twahir. The issue of internet way of networking would not be there if half the world still remains unconnected. Can we discover unconnected areas and reasons for unconnectedness as part of the properties? So that's an interesting question. Andrei, I see that you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I can take this. That's a good question to hear. And what we're actually doing, we're adding something like this in the enablers. So we're adding things as ease of access, availability, capacity to the enablers that actually make access more easy. So sort of we're trying to answer the question or pose the question why some of the areas are not well connected. What prevents, what are the impediments for those areas to get connected? And again, looking from a policy or technology development point of view, these lenses will allow us to analyze the policy. Does the policy make access easier? Does it make capacity more available to citizens, to the users of the internet, and therefore enabling this global access? So while not being, well, in a way you can see that some of the critical properties, they provide the foundation for this global access, right? Like critical property one, open, accessible infrastructure with a common protocol, it actually enables you to get access, to become part of the internet in a quite easy way. But more things, as you note in your question, more things need to be done to really spread this, to really make this available to some of the populations. So that will be covered in enablers in a way. So please stay tuned, and we hope you can work with us to provide feedback.
Thank you. So, Emmanuel, if you still would like to speak, you are permitted to speak. You can just unmute your microphone and you can share your question or comments. We have another questions from Jolie in the chat. Is IWN coordinating with the IGF Dynamic Coalition on core internet values?
That's it. That's a good question, Jolie. And yes, we have been had communications with them. And I think if it was you, Andrei, or if it was Olaf, who did a presentation with the Dynamic Coalition presenting some of our work, and we had Andrei and our colleague Konstantinos did a session at the IGF last year talking about these different frameworks that exists already to think about what's important about the internet. And that question is also good because it allows us to also mention that when we say the internet way of networking, we're not saying that this is the one and true all truth about the internet. There can exist other frameworks for describing what is important about the internet. The really critical part here is that you have what we believe from an internet society point of view to be the important parts of the internet. And importantly, that we're capturing similar things as others when they're describing what's important about the internet. So this was actually part of the research that went into formulating these critical properties to look at other frameworks out there that has tried to describe the essence of the internet and look for similarities. Because the basic idea here is that we should all have a somewhat shared view about what's important about the internet and reflect about those things when we're doing decisions about the internet, and to have them as a baseline for doing internet impact assessments. So yes, we have been working with the Dynamic Coalition, and of course they're doing work that is highly related to this, and the exchange of ideas between those I think is very important, both to help improve our work, and hopefully we can contribute insights to others that are thinking about these essential features about the internet.
Thank you, Carl. We have another hand up, but I'd like to pass it to Emmanuel one more time if you have a comment or a question to address. Okay, if not, let's go to the next person. Right, we can hear you, Emmanuel. No? Okay. So we also have a hand up from Billy. Billy, you may ask your question or your comment.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, we can hear you.
How are you? I'm fine. Now I have no question. We can continue.
All right, thank you, Emmanuel. I'd like to then pass the floor to Billy James. If you have a question, since you have a hand up.
I think I mistakenly pressed the raise hand button. Pardon me. There's no question to ask, please.
Well, if you press, you have to answer. You have to ask a question. That's the rule.
I know, right? Thank you. The next time I'm gonna ask a question.
All right, thank you, Billy. All right, I don't see any more questions. If you have any questions, please, we still have a couple of more minutes. You may still ask them in the chat, in the Q&A, or you may raise your hand. We will give the floor to you. Otherwise, Carl or Andrei, would you like to talk a little bit about the ISOC Fundamentals catalog, or would you like me to do that?
I think it would be best if you talked about that, who knows it better than we do, I think. Just before that, I just wanted to encourage people, if there's no questions about the specific work that we're doing, as I mentioned, we're very much looking for partners in this, people that would be interested in doing these type of impact assessments. to hear from the group here if people could see the value of this work in their own local communities. If you have, for instance, policies that are currently developed in your countries that you think could be relevant for an impact assessment like this, and also to understand better. We've tried to build this work in 2020, and we're hoping to accelerate this work. If you have looked at the materials in the past, what is missing? General feedback would be greatly appreciated on this call as well. Things that we can do to help improve this work going forward. So if you don't have specific questions about the presentation per se, do please feel free to jump in and share your perceptions of what we've done so far, or other things that you see could be needed going forward.
Thanks, Carl. And we have one question from Jolie. He asks, although it's quite early, are there any examples of the IIAT that has already been showing impact?
Yeah, so we were really excited when we actually launched this in the second half of last year. I can't remember the exact date we launched it now. I think it was October. But it was already put to use, first of all, by us as staff, because this is important to note as well. This is a very helpful tool for us as well internally when we're looking at new policies coming out to help us with these impact assessments. So we use the framework in our own contribution to the Digital Service Act, for instance. There we're referencing this impact on the critical properties. We also used it to express our concern about the Clean Networks program that came out. But the case that I think was really inspiring for us was that the DC chapter in the US created their own communications, conducting a light analysis on the impact of these critical properties on what I think, if it was the Clean Networks program or if it was the TikTok ban, I can't remember right now, but it was really encouraging for us to see that this independent work that we're hoping for most of our community to be able to do with the help of this toolkit could happen in a very short period of time, so that they could take this toolkit, conduct their own analysis, and form this principled statement as to why this policy was really bad at the time. And that was conducted in a very, very short period of time. So that's the type of impact that we've seen in the short term, where both ourselves are able to articulate our positions more clearly, but also where community members have been able to use the toolkit in order to advocate in their own local environments. But the impact has been, on a very short period of time, very encouraging. We already have, for instance, even before it was launched, inspired by the P2P, our colleagues in Brazil partnered with a university to create a course around the Internet way of networking and thinking about policies from the Internet way of networking lens and so forth. So in the short period of time that this work has been public and active, we're really encouraged to see the response that it's had, and we're hoping for that trend to continue. And just the most recent thing we did was to include this type of assessment in the contribution to the Canadian regulator on a policy that they're proposing around blocking botnets, and help provide our view of what the proposed policy could mean for the internet. And that was really encouraged by other stakeholders in Canada that liked the way that we articulated the challenge through the internet way of networking. So we're really encouraged to see the effect that it's had in the short term.
And maybe just to add to this, Carl, so if you look at the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, it basically consists of two parts. One is the narrative itself. I think narrative itself, it explains to some of the policymakers what the internet is, and sort of beyond Facebook and sort of those applications and issues they're dealing with, to really show that all the variety, all this vibrant ecosystem, it's based on these foundational principles. And that's a very powerful thing. And we were approached by quite a few policymakers and made presentations to some of the regulators. And that was very illuminating for them to see, okay, well, all right, there is more than just those apps and those issues that we're dealing with. And another one is this framework to help people to provide analysis and advocate for certain positions. And of course, impact of this is not by the framework itself, but by the energy people and communities put into this assessment, how they promote, like the example of DC chapter that Carl mentioned, and some of our Brazilian colleagues that are working on this. So we are really encouraging sort of what we need to do is spread this, toolkit as a guiding tool, right? To be used in local conditions, looking at local developments to conduct this analysis, and that analysis can make real impact.
Thank you. We have a couple of new questions. Alex Weeks asks, most drivers of the internet are from developed countries. What can we do in developing world to promote internet way of networking, and give some examples?
So I can start that, and we'll let Andrei jump in as well. I think the great value of, first of all, that document that describes the internet way of networking is that it articulates that you have a choice when you do networking to do it the internet way of doing it, right? And I think that message of, if you want to connect your communities, if you want to enable your societies to be part of that global whole, it's important to continue on the trajectory of this networking model. As Andrei mentioned, one of the critical properties, for instance, the number one there about an accessible infrastructure, it allows new networks to join the internet, become part of the global whole. So if you're thinking about it from, for instance, a development, economic development policy point of view, it's a good tool to just highlight that if you want to have prosperity and economic prosperity in your communities, the internet allows for low barriers to become part of a global market, for instance. If you stick to this networking model, it allows you to, for instance, create access networks like community networks that can more easily become part of the global whole. So it's a way for how you connect your societies, or the message for how you promote connectivity can be used to sort of be targeted in that context, that it's very conducive to growing and allowing more people to join. But it depends a little bit on the challenges that you see in your local communities. Ideally, the more people understand what makes the internet, and the more people that look at potential policies or other things through the lens on impacting those critical properties, you can also hold people to account. So if the challenge is also about, for instance, negative developments in your local communities where, say, a particular government is trying to impose very restrictive policies on how you can use the internet and so forth, you can conduct these impact assessments, describe that this not only affects users, it also affects how this network itself operates, and in consequence, what opportunities that network brings to your local community. And by having that assessment, you can hold those decision makers to account. And that's what we're hoping in the long term for this to enable you to do, that the more the word around this work spread, the more people realize the value of preserving that networking model, the more you can hold people to account when they are going against or imposing policies that goes against that idea of how you do networking the internet way, or how you create the internet. I hope that was somewhat of an answer, because I think that the advocacy is highly contextual and comes down to the local context for how to use it and the benefits that it has. I think in practical terms of how to promoting the work, again, I think that comes down to local communities, the opportunities that you might have in the chapter to engage with policymakers and organize a workshop. Those can differ between chapters, of course, and it can differ on how acceptable are policymakers in your communities to engaging with civil society and so forth. So I don't think I have an answer to how to specifically promote it in a developing country context, but I do think that there's a strength in the narrative for both the policies that needs to expand the internet and those that needs to sort of protect the internet in developing countries.
Thank you. I see Andrei is responding to a question. Another question that was asked is, there is value in this work. How is the work going to be harmonized with the work of the Internet Governance Forum, ITU, and other organizations promoting standards and regulation? And how can we follow up on doing information sessions for regulators and other interested parties?
Yeah, I guess that comes in a little bit to how we define harmonized, but the idea here is that there's not really any barriers to where this message should go. We're interested in carrying this message in all different forums, whether that is the Internet Governance Forum. We think it's, specifically in that environment, like the Internet Governance Forum, we think this could be a very helpful lens to help focus the discussions at the IGF that sometimes can get very broad. And the Internet way of networking helps you sort of ground the work a little bit in thinking about what discussions at the IGF, which is supposed to be about Internet governance, right, can benefit from thinking about how it impacts the networking model itself. And as I mentioned, our description of this is our own description. We hope others buy into it and recognize and see these critical properties the way that we do. But at least it should inspire people to think about the internet as a distinct way for how you have independent parties, independent networks work together to create that global architecture. And just having that recognition, I think, is really important to shape discussions in a forum like the IGF to almost go back to the roots and recognize that, oh, it's a network of networks with voluntary participation. That is the essence of this. And the discussions that we're having now might benefit from reflecting on how it impacts that networking model as articulated by ISOC. But it's not meant to be the one and all thing that provides the reference point for what the internet is. It's really to help encourage people to think about the internet from a particular lens and to use it where helpful. So that's what I mean by harmonization, where we're not expecting all of the rest of the world to come out and say, the noun that we have, the internet way of networking. It's really more about projecting the idea and the lens of thinking about the internet from this perspective. And that would be valuable in the IGF. I think it's valuable to also having discussions at the ITU, for instance, where you describe that these developments, they not only impact internet as this vague sort of socioeconomic construct. No, it impacts the very network operations, particular policies or regulations that could be discussed at the ITU have a bearing on this. So it's less about promoting the noun of the internet way of networking in another fora, but the idea of looking at the internet from this perspective. And I think that's where the harmonization aspects is what we're trying to promote, to have others see the internet from the way that we see it, not necessarily having the name internet way of networking present everywhere.
Thank you. We have one hand up. I'm going to give the floor to speak.
Yeah, thank you. This is my name is Yrjö Länsipuro from ISOC Finland. I'm also involved in the planning of the Eurodig, which is the European forum, European Internet Forum, in a way, one of the many children of the original IGF. And this year, the Eurodig will take place at the end of June. And on the agenda, of course, DSA, DMA, a lot of things that are happening, this sort of big stuff, big regulation stuff that is sort of sailing up. So I think, thank you very much for the presentation. I think that to present the impact assessment toolkit would be a really good companion piece for this. So please expect somebody taking contact with you about this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to come and do a presentation. Absolutely.
Thank you, Carl. And we have, I think, one more question from Sergio. Internet should be treated as a utility like electricity and water. Does the phrase capture that essence of IWN? And what is the position of ISOC on net neutrality?
Right. So this is a long-standing question. There is a crux in there when you talk about the internet being treated as a utility from a regulatory perspective, because utilities are regulated in a certain way. I think that we wouldn't want the internet to be regulated in that way, because that imposes certain regulations that effectively sort of interferes with this voluntary independence of the networks. However, there is, of course, a sentiment in there in terms of the importance of the internet, like electricity and water, that it kind of is the bloodstream of society in many ways. But that doesn't mean that the regulation that is appropriate is to regulate it like a utility, like water or electricity, for instance. And that comes down to how the sort of technical construct works. And that is grounded in the fact that you have independent networks coming together to share resources and create this greater picture. So in response to your question, if Frey captured the essence of the I1, I wouldn't say that it captures the essence of it. I think it rather highlights the importance of it, that it highlights why the internet has become such an important tool for societies and can be comparable to water and electricity. And it is because it allows societies to really build any new application, to use it in a kind of unlimited fashion in terms of producing new things. And that's why it's become really the live stream for society. But in terms of the utility phrasing, that's where the crux comes in, because there's a history of how you regulate utilities that isn't an appropriate regulatory model for the internet. And that comes down to the very essence of the architecture that these critical properties describe, the fact that you have independent networks voluntarily interconnecting to create a bigger whole.
Right. Thank you, Carl. And I think we have one more minute before we end. So I'd just like to remind all of the participants and who are part of the Aisyah Fundamental Program that in order for you to be eligible for a certificate, you have to carry out an initiative. And to help guide you on what kind of initiative you can do, you can go to the Internet Society Fundamentals Catalog that I've shared a link in the chat. And with that, we look forward to your initiatives. We look forward to your participation in the IWN project. Thank you very much, Carl, and also Andrei, who just had to leave, for your presentations and for sharing your insights. Thank you for joining. I hope you have a good weekend, and to my Muslim colleagues, Ramadan Kareem. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all very much.